The Silver Ridge Equestrian Showcase was buzzing with excitement. People filled the grandstands, their eyes fixed on the massive arena where the wild stallion, Thunder, was being held. The horse, a true force of nature, was anything but tame. Muscular, black as midnight, with a fierce snort and eyes that burned with a fiery spirit, Thunder was every bit as untamable as the Nevada plains he had come from. For days, trainers had tried everything in their power to break him. Ropes, whips, even tranquilizers, but nothing had worked. Thunder refused to submit, his wild nature too strong to be contained. He kicked, bucked, and refused to be bridled by anyone or anything. The announcer chuckled dryly into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, this one's got a heart of steel. They say he doesn't bow to anyone. Let's see if that's true." The crowd let out a mix of laughs and gasps, knowing that the stallion was a spectacle to watch, but impossible to control. It was a thrilling display of raw power, but also a reminder of the wild, untamable nature of some creatures. Yet, the crowd was about to witness something that would make their jaws drop, something no one could have predicted. From the corner of the arena, a teenage boy in a wheelchair rolled slowly into view. His name was Julian Price. His appearance was a shock to everyone. A 17-year-old who had once been a champion rider, Julian was now paralyzed, the result of a brutal ATV accident 2 years prior. His body, once so full of life and energy, was now bound to a wheelchair. The same energy, the same fearlessness that had once defined him, seemed lost, buried under the weight of his trauma. As Julian rolled closer to the ring, the murmurs began. Whispers spread like wildfire through the crowd. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. "What's this kid gonna do?" one person muttered. "He can't even walk. He's not gonna get near that horse." Julian didn't seem to notice the laughter or the incredulity in the eyes of the spectators. His mother, walking beside him, looked at him with a hopeful yet wary expression. She had brought him to this event with the hope that it might lift his spirits, to remind him of the life he once had. She had hoped he'd find a spark, something that could pull him from the dark, quiet place he had retreated to, but Julian hadn't shown any interest in anything, not until now. He wheeled forward, undeterred by the sneers and whispers, and stopped just outside the ring. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair, knuckles white from the force. There was no hesitation in his eyes as he stared at the wild stallion. The people in the stands watched with bated breath, the energy in the air thick with disbelief. The announcer, sensing the odd tension in the air, added, "Well, folks, we've got a real surprise here. It looks like the kid wants a shot at Thunder. What do you think, people?" A laugh erupted from the crowd, followed by a few more dismissive comments. "This is going to be good," one person snickered, but Julian was already moving, lifting his hand. The murmurs grew louder. It wasn't just disbelief anymore. It was a mixture of skepticism, disbelief, and perhaps even a hint of amusement. Julian didn't let the doubt break his resolve. He looked at the stallion and spoke, his voice calm but steady. "I know what it's like to lose control." It was a strange thing to say to a horse, but in that moment, it wasn't about control. It wasn't about breaking Thunder. It was something deeper, something that no one could quite understand yet. The crowd, quiet now, watched in stunned silence as Thunder turned his head sharply toward the boy in the wheelchair. He snorted and stomped his hooves, the ground shaking beneath him. Julian remained still, eyes locked with the wild horse. He didn't shout commands, didn't try to force Thunder into submission. Instead, he waited, and the air seemed to grow thicker. The crowd was utterly captivated now. Thunder circled around him, moving with jerky, unpredictable steps, but Julian didn't flinch. His face remained calm, his eyes steady on the horse. Then, in a moment that seemed to stretch on forever, Thunder stopped. He lowered his head, slowly, inch by inch, until the massive stallion was kneeling before Julian. The silence that followed was deafening. The crowd, who had been on the edge of their seats, was now utterly still. The skeptical murmurs stopped, replaced by stunned, open-mouthed stares. No one moved. No one dared to breathe. Julian looked up, his lips curling into the faintest of smiles. The crowd erupted into applause, but it was a distant sound, almost muted, as if they were witnessing something far more profound than any of them had ever expected. Thunder, the untamable beast, had bowed to a boy in a wheelchair. And in that instant, something changed in the air, a shift in the space between the boy and the horse, between the world and all who witnessed it. The crowd's applause echoed in Julian's ears, but it felt distant, like a faint hum. He hadn't asked for this attention, and yet here he was, the center of everyone's gaze. People were still whispering, still staring in disbelief at the boy in the wheelchair who had tamed the wild stallion, Thunder, with nothing but a soft word and a steady gaze. But Julian wasn't listening to the applause. He was focused on the silence that followed. That connection he had made with Thunder, it was everything. It was something he had been missing, something he had lost the moment his life had turned upside down 2 years ago. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Julian's mother, Sarah, wheeled him quietly toward the edge of the arena. She had a proud smile on her face, but her eyes were filled with something else, something much deeper, worry. Julian had been so withdrawn ever since the accident, and this sudden burst of connection with the horse, well, it was both a relief and a reminder of how much he had changed. "Julian," she said softly, her voice a little too high-pitched, trying to sound positive. "That was incredible. I haven't seen you like that in a long time." Julian didn't respond immediately. His hands were clenched tightly around the wheels of his chair, his gaze fixed forward, as if trying to see something beyond the horse in the crowd. He could feel his mother's gaze on him, waiting for him to speak, but he couldn't find the words. 2 years ago, Julian had been a different person. He had been fearless, confident, the star of every equestrian event. He had been strong, vibrant, a natural on horseback, winning championship after championship. The world had been his oyster, and he had thought it would stay that way forever. But then, everything changed, in an instant. It had been a Saturday morning when it happened. He and a few friends had decided to go for a ride on their ATVs, just outside of town. They were reckless, laughing, racing each other along the dirt roads, pushing the limits of their machines. Julian had been leading, as usual, full of adrenaline and excitement, but then, just as quickly as it had all started, it ended. A sharp turn, a momentary loss of control, and his ATV flipped. Julian had barely had time to react before he hit the ground, his spine snapping under the impact. The doctors had said it was a miracle he was alive. But alive didn't mean whole. Alive didn't mean the same person he had been before. The accident had left him paralyzed from the waist down, and it had crushed something inside him. It had taken away his love for the very thing that had defined him, riding horses. His mother had tried everything, therapy, support groups, anything she could think of to pull him out of the deep hole he had fallen into. But Julian had refused. He stopped talking to his friends, stopped participating in family events, and most painfully, stopped speaking about the one thing he had always loved. Horses. It had been a year since his accident when his mother finally made the decision to bring him to the Silver Ridge Equestrian Showcase. She knew it was a long shot, but she hoped that somehow, being surrounded by the world he once knew, would bring him some peace. She hoped that maybe, just maybe, it would spark something in him again. But when they had arrived at the event, Julian had been distant, aloof. He had barely shown any interest in the horses, and when Thunder had been introduced, he had turned his head away, unwilling to watch, until that moment when he saw the wild stallion. Now, as he sat silently in his chair, looking at the empty arena, he couldn't help but wonder what it had all meant. He had connected with Thunder in a way he hadn't connected with anyone, not in the last 2 years. It wasn't just a bond with the horse. It was something deeper, something inside him that he hadn't realized was still there. But it was hard to feel victorious, hard to feel like this was the beginning of something new, when all Julian could think about was the accident, the pain, the loss, the overwhelming feeling of helplessness. "You did good, kid," a voice called out, snapping Julian out of his doubts. He turned to see one of the trainers from the event, a man named Hank, walking toward him. Hank was tall, with graying hair and a no-nonsense attitude. He had been one of the trainers who had worked with Thunder, and he had watched the entire scene unfold in stunned silence. Julian said nothing at first, but Hank wasn't deterred. He knelt down beside him, his expression softening. "You're a natural," he said. "That's a gift you've got with horses. Not everyone can get through to them like that." Julian met his gaze but said nothing. His mind was still swirling with thoughts he didn't know how to voice. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate Hank's words, but they felt like they didn't belong in his world anymore. He wasn't the same Julian. That boy who had ridden and won championships didn't exist anymore. The boy in the wheelchair was all that was left. "You know," Hank continued, "I've seen a lot of trainers try to work with Thunder, and none of them ever got him to kneel like that. It's something special you've got there, Julian." It wasn't lost on Julian that Hank was trying to get him to see what everyone else saw. Something remarkable, something unique. But the truth was, Julian didn't know how to feel about it. He was grateful for the attention, sure, but part of him wished he could just be left alone, to fade back into the shadows, where he could hide from the world he had once been a part of. He could hear his mother's voice in the back of his mind, urging him to talk, to share, to open up. But Julian wasn't sure he could. Not yet. He wasn't ready to confront the pieces of himself that had been shattered, pieces that he had been avoiding for so long. As the event continued, Julian stayed silent, his eyes occasionally drifting toward Thunder, who was being led back to the stable. He didn't know where this connection with the horse would take him. He didn't know if he was ready for it. But for the first time in a long time, Julian felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, he could rebuild himself, just as Thunder had rebuilt his trust. And maybe, with time, he could find his way back to the person he used to be. The next few days in Silver Ridge were a blur for Julian. The aftershock of his connection with Thunder still lingered in the air, a feeling he couldn't quite shake. He wasn't sure if it was the excitement, the unexpected attention, or something deeper, but his mind was constantly drawn back to the wild stallion, Thunder's wild eyes, his muscular frame, and that moment when the massive horse lowered his head before him, almost like a confession of some sort, kept repeating in his mind. Thunder wasn't just any horse. He was a force of nature, a wild stallion, captured from the rugged Nevada plains. Thunder had lived free, unshackled, untamed, a beast whose spirit could not be broken. There were few horses as fiercely independent and even fewer trainers who dared to challenge him. Yet, Julian had seen something in Thunder that few others did. As the morning sun climbed over the horizon, casting a warm glow over the Silver Ridge Arena, Julian found himself once again in the stands, watching the stallion in his corral. Thunder paced back and forth in his pen, his heavy hooves striking the ground with a thunderous sound. The power in his movements was undeniable. Julian could feel the energy radiating off the horse, almost as if Thunder's every muscle was vibrating with the desire to escape. Thunder's reputation had spread like wildfire after the showcase. Word had gotten out about the kid in the wheelchair who had somehow tamed the untamable. The trainers had all heard the rumors, and most were skeptical. They'd been attempting to train Thunder for months, but he resisted every effort. No one had been able to make any headway. His spirit was too wild, his trust too broken. But now, Julian had done what no one else could. He had connected with him. As Julian sat quietly watching, Hank, one of the event's lead trainers, approached. Hank was the type of man who looked like he had seen it all. His hands were calloused from years of working with horses, his face weathered by the sun. He had a quiet, no-nonsense way about him, but there was something in his eyes now. Something new. Something unexpected. "That boy of yours," Hank began, his voice gruff but thoughtful. "He's something special." Julian turned his head slowly to meet Hank's gaze, but he said nothing. He wasn't sure how to respond to the praise. It made him uncomfortable, like he didn't quite deserve it. The idea of being special, of being noticed, felt foreign to him now. "I've worked with Thunder for a long time," Hank continued, his gaze lingering on the wild stallion. "And I've never seen him like this. Not once. He's stubborn, hard-headed. I don't think anyone's ever gotten close to him the way your boy did. It's like he's finally found someone he trusts." Julian shifted in his chair, looking down at his hands. He didn't feel like he deserved that kind of trust, especially not after everything that had happened to him. It wasn't just the accident that had broken him. It was the way the world had changed around him, how his entire identity had crumbled when he could no longer ride horses, when he could no longer feel free. Hank seemed to read his thoughts, his eyes softening. "I know it's hard," Hank said, his tone more compassionate than Julian had expected. "But what you did with Thunder, that wasn't just about the horse. It was about you, about showing him that trust doesn't have to be earned through force. Sometimes it just takes someone who understands what it means to be vulnerable." Julian let out a slow breath, his chest tight with emotions he didn't know how to express. His gaze drifted back to Thunder, who had stopped pacing and was now grazing peacefully near the fence. It was as if the horse was at ease, something Julian couldn't quite believe. Do you think it could work?" Julian asked, his voice low. Hank looked at him for a long moment before answering. "I think you've already proven it can work, but you'll need time. Thunder's not like any other horse. He's been through things we can't even imagine. But I've seen something in you, Julian. I think you've got what it takes to really reach him, just like you did before." The words hung in the air between them, and Julian could feel a flicker of something deep inside him. Hope. But it was a fragile hope, the kind that came with uncertainty and doubt. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," Julian said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can handle it again." Hank nodded, understanding the fear behind Julian's words. "You don't have to handle it all at once. It's about small steps, trusting yourself, and trusting Thunder." The words were simple, but they struck a chord in Julian. Trust. It was a concept he had avoided for so long. After the accident, after losing everything, Julian had built walls around himself. He had shut out the world, refusing to let anyone in, and most of all, refusing to trust himself. But with Thunder, with the horse, Julian felt something stirring. There was a connection between them, something unspoken and deep. It was raw, vulnerable, but it was also real. For the first time in a long time, Julian allowed himself to hope. "All right," Julian said finally, his voice steady. "I'll try." Hank smiled, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "That's all we need, kid. Just give it a shot. The rest will follow." Over the next few days, Julian began spending more time with Thunder. He wheeled himself into the corral, not with force or urgency, but with patience. He would sit quietly at the edge, watching the stallion move, observing every twitch of his muscles, every flick of his ears. He didn't rush things. He didn't try to make Thunder do anything. He just waited, and slowly Thunder began to change. At first, it was subtle, the way the horse's movements slowed when he saw Julian, the way he would stand a little closer, just within reach. Julian could feel the shift, like a small crack in Thunder's wall of resistance. It was the beginning of something. Julian could sense it. He wasn't sure where it would lead, but for the first time in a long time, Julian felt like he was on the right path, not just with Thunder, but with himself, The Silver Ridge Equestrian Showcase had now entered its second day, and the excitement in the air was palpable. The stands were packed with spectators from all over, eager to witness the wild, unpredictable spectacle that had come to define the event. Yet, no one could have anticipated the turn of events that was about to unfold. Thunder, the wild stallion, had become the center of attention, a living legend whose untamed spirit had captivated everyone who witnessed his fiery displays. And now, just when it seemed like the horse could not be tamed, another surprise was in store. This time, it would come from the boy in the wheelchair. It was late afternoon when the announcement came. The crowd hushed in anticipation as the announcer's voice rang out over the loudspeakers. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special surprise today. It looks like Julian Price, the young man who captivated us all by connecting with Thunder, has decided to step up and work with him once more. Julian hadn't planned on this moment. In fact, when his mother had first suggested he take the chance to work with Thunder again, Julian had been hesitant. He wasn't sure he could repeat what had happened the other day. What if the connection had been a fluke? What if the horse didn't respond the same way? What if he failed? But his mother, ever supportive, had reminded him that it wasn't about proving something to anyone. It was about healing for both him and the horse. And so Julian had agreed, but only under his own terms. Now, as he wheeled himself into the center of the arena, the crowd was silent, unsure of what to expect. The murmurs began again, the whispers of doubt creeping into the air. The kid? In the chair? He's going to work with Thunder? I thought Thunder was untamable. Well, this ought to be interesting. But Julian didn't hear them. He didn't hear the skepticism or the disbelief. His mind was focused, his body tense but steady. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. But it wasn't just about Thunder anymore. It wasn't even just about the crowd. This was about him, about reclaiming a part of himself he had lost. It was about showing that he wasn't finished, that he still had something to offer. As Julian rolled into the center of the ring, Thunder was being led into the other side. The stallion's movements were still wild, his eyes filled with the same defiance that had earned him his reputation. He wasn't easy to control. He didn't want to be controlled. But then, Julian had never intended to control him. Thunder snorted loudly, his hooves pounding the ground as he neared the center of the ring. The horse's muscles rippled beneath his black coat, his eyes wide and unyielding. It was clear he didn't trust anyone. Not yet. Julian didn't move right away. He remained still, his hands resting lightly on the wheels of his chair, his gaze focused on the stallion. He could feel the tension in the air, the electricity crackling between them. The crowd was waiting, holding their breath. He had no ropes, no whips, no tools to tame the beast. It was just him and Thunder. No distractions, no expectations, just a moment that could change everything. For a long moment, the two remained locked in an unspoken stare, each one measuring the other. Thunder snorted and pawed the ground as if to remind Julian of his power. But Julian didn't flinch. He stayed steady, calm, waiting. Then, softly, almost as if he were speaking to himself, Julian spoke. "I'm not going to force you, Thunder," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm not here to control you. I know what it's like to be scared. I know what it's like to feel trapped, but I'm not here to hurt you." The words were simple, but they carried a weight. Julian wasn't trying to prove anything to the crowd, wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was speaking to the horse. He was letting Thunder know that he understood, that he didn't have to fight anymore. Thunder's ears flicked back and forth as he circled Julian, uncertain, still wary. The horse had been through so much. He had been captured, broken, and forced into a world that didn't understand him. He had fought, he had resisted, and he had done everything he could to protect his freedom. But Julian wasn't like the others. Julian wasn't asking for domination. He wasn't trying to break Thunder. He was offering something much simpler: trust. And slowly, Thunder began to settle, The wildness in his eyes softened. He stopped pacing in circles, his breathing slowing. The tension in his body started to ease. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a sign. Julian wheeled a few inches forward, never taking his eyes off the stallion. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "I'm not asking for anything from you. Just trust me, like I trust you." The crowd watched in stunned silence as Thunder moved closer. The massive horse, once a force of untamable rage, now stood just a few feet away from Julian. The air between them was still electric, charged with the weight of everything that had happened and everything that was yet to come. And then something incredible happened. Thunder took a step forward, then another. He was moving closer to Julian, not in fear, but in curiosity. The stallion, once so resistant, had begun to trust the boy in the chair. The crowd gasped. A few people started to clap, but Julian didn't notice. He was focused on the horse, on the quiet connection that was growing between them. It was no longer a battle. It was no longer about breaking the horse's spirit or proving a point to anyone. It was about healing for both of them. Thunder stopped just a few inches away from Julian, his body tense, but his eyes calm. For the first time, he wasn't fighting. He was waiting. He was listening. And then, as if in response to something unspoken, Thunder slowly lowered his head, just as he had done the other day. It wasn't a bow of submission. It wasn't a trick or a show. It was a simple gesture of respect. The crowd erupted into applause, but Julian barely heard it. He wasn't focused on the crowd. He wasn't focused on anything other than the horse in front of him. He had done it again. Julian Price had made the wild stallion, Thunder, kneel. Not with force, not with dominance, but with trust. And for the first time in a long time, Julian felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Julian sat in the center of the arena, his hands resting gently on the wheels of his chair. The crowd was still buzzing with excitement, but Julian's focus was entirely on Thunder. The wild stallion stood a few feet away, his coat gleaming in the sunlight, his powerful frame still as stone. There was no rush, no urgency. The air between them was charged with something new, something neither of them had ever felt before. For the first time in a long time, Julian wasn't thinking about his wheelchair or his past. He wasn't even thinking about the people watching him, their eyes full of disbelief and admiration. He was just there, in the moment, with Thunder. The crowd had gone silent, waiting to see what would happen next. They were mesmerized by the connection that had formed between the boy in the wheelchair and the wild stallion. But to Julian, it wasn't about the show. It wasn't about the spectacle or the audience. It was about the quiet bond that had been forged between him and the horse. It was about something deeper than the words he could speak or the movements he could make. Julian had learned long ago that the most powerful connections didn't need to be shouted from the rooftops. Sometimes the deepest bonds were formed in silence. It was the way Thunder moved now, with a sense of calm instead of his usual chaos. It was the way he looked at Julian, not with suspicion or defiance, but with curiosity, as if the wild stallion had begun to understand that this boy, the seemingly fragile person in the chair, was not his enemy. For the first time, Julian wasn't asking for anything from Thunder. He wasn't trying to tame him, to break him, or to force him into submission. He wasn't trying to prove anything to the crowd or to himself. He was simply there, in the quiet space between them, allowing the horse to come to him on his own terms. And allowing, Thunder did. Slowly, cautiously, the stallion took a step forward. His hooves stirred up dust as he moved closer to Julian. His eyes never left the boy, and for the first time, Julian could see the hesitation in the horse's gaze. Thunder had been through so much, been forced to fight for his freedom, and now, after all the battles, he was beginning to let go. He was beginning to trust. Julian didn't move. He didn't reach out for the horse. He simply spoke, his voice low but steady. It's okay. You don't have to fight anymore. I'm not going to hurt you. The words hung in the air, simple yet profound. It wasn't just about the horse. It was about Julian, too. He had been fighting, too, fighting the pain, the fear, the loss of control. But now, in this moment, he wasn't fighting anymore. He was choosing to trust. He was choosing to let go. Thunder took another step, then another. Slowly, cautiously, the wild stallion moved closer until he was standing directly in front of Julian. The crowd gasped as they watched the two form a connection that defied all expectations. But to Julian, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. It wasn't magic. It wasn't some grand trick. It was simply two beings, one broken and the other wild, finding peace in each other's presence. Julian held Thunder's gaze, never breaking eye contact. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the moment, but he didn't rush it. This wasn't about making Thunder do something for him. It was about allowing the horse to come to him on his own terms, at his own pace. And then, without warning, Thunder lowered his head. It wasn't the blow of submission he had given before. This time, it was different. This time, it was a gesture of acceptance. It was as if the wild stallion had finally understood what Julian had been trying to show him all along. That trust wasn't something that could be demanded. It was something that had to be earned, slowly and gently over time. The crowd was silent now, their disbelief replaced with awe. They had all expected a dramatic confrontation, a battle between the boy and the horse. But what they had witnessed instead was something much more powerful. A quiet connection, formed without words, without force, without the need for control. It was the kind of bond that only a few rare souls ever experienced. A bond based on understanding, empathy, and the willingness to trust. Julian didn't smile, didn't raise his arms in triumph. He simply looked at Thunder, his heart full of something he hadn't felt in a long time, peace. He didn't need the applause. He didn't need the approval of the crowd. For the first time in 2 years, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Not in the spotlight, but in the quiet, unspoken bond between him and the horse. He spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to do anything. Just be with me. That's all I need. And Thunder, the untamable wild stallion, stood before him, his head lowered in quiet acceptance. The horse, once a symbol of unbroken spirit, was now a symbol of something even more powerful, the ability to heal, to trust, and to connect. The crowd erupted into applause, but Julian barely noticed. He wasn't thinking about the audience or the spectacle they had just witnessed. He was thinking about Thunder, thinking about how far they had both come, how they had both learned to trust again. In that moment, Julian realized that he wasn't just healing the horse, he was healing seated himself. The announcer's voice rang out, breaking the silence that had settled over the arena. Ladies and gentlemen, what you've just witnessed is nothing short of extraordinary. Julian Price, the young man in the wheelchair, has shown us that sometimes the most powerful connections aren't made with force or domination. They're made with patience, trust, and understanding. Julian closed his eyes, taking in a deep breath. He had done it. Not just for the crowd, not just for Thunder, but for himself. And in that quiet, powerful moment, Julian realized that he hadn't just tamed Thunder. He had tamed his own fear, his own doubt, and his own brokenness. The journey wasn't over, but it was no longer about control. It was about connection. And that was something Julian had found, both with the wild stallion and with himself. In the days following Julian's remarkable interaction with Thunder, word spread like wildfire. The crowd at Silver Ridge had witnessed something extraordinary, and soon social media was flooded with videos and images of the boy in the wheelchair and the wild stallion. But for Julian, The attention was both a blessing and a burden. He hadn't asked for any of it, but somehow the world had taken notice. What had been a moment of personal connection between him and the horse was now a spectacle for everyone to see. But Julian wasn't focused on the attention. He was focused on Thunder. In the quiet moments after the showcase, Julian would often sit by the corral, watching the stallion, feeling the weight of the responsibility that had now fallen on his shoulders. He knew he had to take the next step, not just for himself, but for Thunder. The horse was still wild, still untamed, and Julian knew that his initial connection wasn't enough. It was only the beginning. Hank, the trainer who had been with Thunder from the start, had watched Julian carefully over the past few days. He had seen the connection Julian had formed with the stallion, and he knew that there was something unique about the way the two interacted. But he also knew that the real work was just beginning. "Julian," Hank said one morning as he approached the young man by the corral, "you've done something no one else has been able to do, but you can't stop there. You've got to teach Thunder, slowly and steadily, just like you've been doing." Julian looked up, meeting Hank's gaze. He had always respected the older man's expertise with horses, but now there was something else in his voice, something that hinted at a deeper understanding. "You're right," Julian replied, his voice steady. "But I'm not sure how to teach him. I don't know where to start." Hank smiled, a small glimmer of pride in his eyes. "You already know how to teach him. You've shown it right here, just by being with him. It's not about force. It's not about dominance. It's about rhythm, patience, and trust." For the next few days, Julian spent hours by Thunder's side, working with the horse under Hank's watchful eye. At first, there were moments of doubt. Thunder was still a wild animal, and despite their connection, he wasn't ready to follow Julian's lead completely. The horse's movements were jerky, unpredictable. One minute, Thunder would walk toward Julian, his head lowered in acceptance, and the next, he would stomp off, his tail flicking in irritation. But Julian didn't get frustrated. He had learned long ago that pushing too hard only made things worse. He had to be patient. He had to allow Thunder to come to him, not force him into submission. "I know what it's like to feel out of control," Julian would often say as he worked with Thunder. "I know what it feels like to be lost, but you don't have to fight it anymore." The process wasn't easy. There were days when Julian felt like he was getting nowhere. Thunder would remain distant, unwilling to come close, his wild nature kicking in. But Julian would stay by the corral, just watching, waiting. He would speak softly, his voice steady, offering comfort in the form of quiet words that Thunder seemed to understand. Slowly, as the days passed, Julian noticed a shift in Thunder. The horse began to approach him more frequently, his steps measured and slow. He would circle Julian, but this time he wasn't moving out of fear or aggression. There was something else there, something that resembled curiosity. And then, one afternoon, it happened. Thunder stopped pacing. He stood still, his muscles rippling beneath his coat as he locked eyes with Julian. The horse's ears flicked forward, and for a brief moment, everything was still. There was no movement from the crowd, no distractions. It was just Julian and Thunder. Alone, in that moment. Julian didn't move. He kept his eyes on the stallion, his body still. "You don't have to do anything, Thunder," he said softly. "Just trust me." To everyone's surprise, Thunder took a step forward, then another. And then, slowly, Thunder circled Julian in a calm, deliberate pattern. His movements were controlled, his energy no longer wild and chaotic. It was the first sign of real progress. The horse was listening. He was following Julian's lead. Hank, who had been watching from the sidelines, nodded in approval. "That's it," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "He's starting to get it. He's starting to trust you, Julian. You're doing it." For Julian, it was a moment of quiet triumph. He hadn't made Thunder do anything. He hadn't forced the horse into submission. He had simply been patient, calm, and consistent. And now, Thunder was responding. Over the next few weeks, Julian continued to work with Thunder every day. There were still setbacks. There were moments when Thunder would resist, when the wild stallion's instincts would take over. But Julian didn't give up. He kept working with the horse, slowly gaining his trust, little by little. There were no ropes, no whips, no harsh methods. It was all about rhythm, tone, and patience. And as the days passed, the bond between Julian and Thunder grew stronger. The horse, once wild and untamable, now followed Julian's voice with a level of trust that few would have believed possible. It wasn't a perfect connection, but it was real. And that was enough for Julian. One afternoon, as Julian wheeled himself into the arena, Thunder walked calmly beside him, his powerful frame moving in rhythm with the boy's wheelchair. The crowd, which had gathered to watch their progress, gasped in amazement. They had never seen anything like this before. The once untamable stallion, the wild beast who had defied every trainer who had tried to break him, was now walking calmly beside a boy in a wheelchair. Julian smiled, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was a smile of quiet understanding. He had done it, not for the crowd, not for the fame, but for himself and for Thunder. He had proven something to himself, something far more important than any victory. He had proven that trust, patience, and understanding were the keys to unlocking something far greater than power or control. He had shown that even the wildest spirits could be tamed, not through force, but through connection. The story of Julian Price and Thunder was everywhere. Social media buzzed with clips from Silver Ridge, showing the boy in the wheelchair, coaxing the wild stallion into moments of calm that no one had thought possible. News outlets picked up the story, calling it miraculous and a triumph of trust over force. People were amazed, they were inspired. And then, as with all things that captured public attention, the backlash began. It started with a quiet whisper, a few voices raised in criticism, questioning whether what Julian had done with Thunder was ethical, whether it was safe. "It's just a stunt," they said. "There's no way a kid in a wheelchair could actually tame a horse like that. Well, it's all a show for the cameras." Some of the trainers who had worked with Thunder were particularly vocal. They pointed to Julian's methods and claimed they were reckless. They argued that Thunder's cooperations was simply the result of a well-timed art spectacle, a lucky moment that didn't represent real training. "It's dangerous," one trainer said in a televised interview. "The boy has no experience. He's not qualified to handle a horse like Thunder." The doubters were relentless. They questioned Julian's ability to continue working with Thunder. They accused him of exploiting the horse for publicity. Some even went so far as to accuse him of putting both his own safety and the horse's safety at risk. In the midst of this growing criticism, Julian found himself at a crossroads. His mother, who had been so proud of him, began to worry. She knew her son, knew how much he had been through, how much this experience with Thunder had meant to him, but now she saw him becoming weighed down by the accusations. The boy who had once been so strong and fearless was now retreating again, pulled into the shadows by the voices of the critics. One afternoon, Julian wheeled himself into the stable where Thunder was resting. He hadn't been back to the arena in a few days, and the weight of the backlash had begun to settle in his chest, suffocating him. He could feel the eyes of the world on him, judging every move, questioning every action. And the worst part was, he wasn't sure how to defend himself. Hank, who had become a mentor of sorts to Julian throughout this journey, was waiting for him in the stable. He had been watching from afar as the media storm swirled around Julian, but he hadn't said much. Now, seeing the look on Julian's face, he knew the boy was struggling. "Hey, Julian," Hank called softly, his voice calm and steady. "How you doing?" Julian didn't answer at first. He just sat there, staring at the ground, the weight of the criticism pressing on him like a heavy blanket. He had never been good at handling attention, especially the negative kind. He had spent years avoiding the spotlight, retreating into the safety of his own thoughts, his own doubts. But now, the world was watching, and the pressure was becoming unbearable. "I don't know if I can do this anymore," Julian finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "All they're doing is tearing me down. They say I'm exploiting Thunder, that I'm not qualified to be working with him. I didn't ask for any of this." Hank's face softened. "I get it, kid. I know it's hard, but you've got something they don't. You've got a connection with Thunder that no one else has, and that's what matters." "But what if it's not enough?" Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. "What if they're right? What if I'm just fooling myself? What if I'm putting Thunder in danger?" Hank took a deep breath. "Julian, you've got to remember why you're doing this. You're not doing it for the cameras, for the applause, or for anyone else. You're doing it for you and for Thunder. That connection, that trust you've built with him, that's real. No one can take that away from you." Julian looked up, meeting Hank's eyes. "But the critics, they won't stop. They're saying that Thunder's just going along with it because he's trained to follow commands. They don't get it." Hank shook his head. "Of course they don't get it. They don't see what you've done with Thunder. They're looking at it from the outside, from a place of control and domination. But you're not controlling Thunder. You're understanding him. That's just something most trainers never learn. They see a wild horse and think they need to break him. But you see the heart. That's why Thunder's following you. Not because you're forcing him, but because he trusts you." The words hit Julian hard. He had always doubted himself, but this moment, with Hank's steady reassurance, made something inside him shift. Maybe the critics didn't understand. Maybe they didn't see the quiet moments, the patience, the hours spent in the stable, waiting for Thunder to take that first step. Maybe they didn't understand that it wasn't about breaking the horse. It was about building a relationship. "But what if the backlash gets worse?" Julian asked, his voice still tinged with doubt. Hank's eyes softened. "Then let it. People are going to talk. They always do. But don't let their doubts become yours. You've already proven that you can reach Thunder in a way no one else can. You don't need to prove anything to anyone but yourself." Julian sat in silence for a moment, feeling the weight of Hank's words sink in. The critics, the media, the doubters, they were just noise. What mattered was what he had with Thunder. What mattered was the trust they had built together, the bond that no one could break. "I'll keep going," Julian said finally, his voice firm. "I won't stop." "Not for them." Hank smiled, a proud glint in his eyes. "That's the spirit. And remember, you've got me in your corner. You're not alone in this." And just like that, something inside Julian clicked. The weight of the backlash didn't disappear, but it became easier to bear. He wasn't doing this for the critics. He wasn't doing it for the applause. He was doing it for Thunder and for himself. The world could question him all they wanted, but the bond he had with the wild stallion and was real. It was something that no amount of criticism could take away. The invitation came unexpectedly, like a flicker of light cutting through the fog of doubt that had clouded Julian's world for so long. The Silver Ridge Equestrian Showcase, where everything had started, had become a launchpad for something bigger than he could have ever imagined. Julian and Thunder's bond had captured the hearts of thousands, and soon the world had taken notice. A prestigious event, the State Equestrian Championships, had invited Julian to compete in the Companion Freestyle division. The Companion Freestyle was a special category designed for equine therapy, but it had never seen a participant like Julian. It was a competition that typically showcased trained riders, those who competed with saddles, reins, and all the traditional trappings of equestrian sports. But Julian wasn't like the others. Julian didn't have a saddle. He didn't have reins. He had nothing but his voice, his wheelchair, and the deep, unspoken bond he shared with Thunder. At first, Julian wasn't sure if he should accept. The pressure was overwhelming. He had never competed in a professional event from his wheelchair. His last memories of competing in the arena were long before the accident, back when his legs had still carried him effortlessly across the horse's back. Now, the thought of riding without a saddle, without any of the tools he had once relied on, seemed both exciting and terrifying. But his mother, ever his pillar of support, had encouraged him to go for it. "Julian," she said, her voice calm but filled with conviction, "this isn't about the competition, it's about you. It's about showing the world what you've become. You and Thunder, you've already won just by being together." And so Julian accepted the invitation. It wasn't about victory anymore. It wasn't even about the competition. It was about showing himself and the world that the bond he had with Thunder wasn't something to be hidden away. It was something to be shared. It was something that mattered. On the day of the event, the atmosphere in the arena was electric. The stands were packed with spectators, all eager to witness the state-level competition. The air buzzed with anticipation, and Julian could feel the weight of it all, the eyes of the crowd on him, the pressure of being the first to compete from a wheelchair in this division. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, a nervous energy that made his palms sweat as he gripped the wheels of his chair. But as he wheeled himself to the center of the arena, Julian reminded himself of something. This was his moment. Not to prove anything to anyone, but to share the connection he had with Thunder, to show the world the quiet power of trust. The announcer's voice rang out over the speakers, introducing Julian and Thunder to the audience. The crowd erupted in applause, but it wasn't the usual kind of applause. It wasn't the loud, exuberant cheer of a traditional performance. It was something quieter, something more respectful, as though the audience knew, on some level, that they were about to witness something extraordinary. Julian wheeled into the center of the arena, Thunder following calmly behind him. There were no whips, no ropes, no saddle to steady him. There was only the horse and the boy, a boy who had once been fearless, but who now found strength in quiet connection rather than bravado. Thunder was magnificent. His sleek black coat gleamed in the sunlight, and his eyes were calm, no longer filled with the wildness that had defined him at the start of this journey. He stood tall and proud beside Julian, a symbol of everything they had both overcome. Together, they were no longer just a boy and a horse. They were a partnership, a team, and today, that partnership would take center stage. Julian's hands rested lightly on the armrests of his wheelchair, his gaze fixed on Thunder. The horse was completely focused on him, his steps steady and purposeful. For a moment, the crowd held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next, and then Julian spoke. His voice was calm, steady, carrying across the arena. "Thunder," he said. "Let's show them what trust looks like." With that simple command, Thunder took the first step forward, walking beside Julian as they began their routine. The music played softly in the background, a melody that seemed to speak to the connection they shared. There was no grand choreography, no complex tricks. It was just Thunder, walking at Julian's side, his movements synchronized with the boy in the wheelchair. And then, in a moment that left the crowd breathless, Julian reached out and placed his hand gently on Thunder's neck. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a signal for the horse to do something. It was simply an offering, a gesture of trust and connection. Thunder, without hesitation, responded. He lowered his head slightly, his powerful muscles rippling beneath his coat as he moved with grace and precision. His steps were steady, in perfect harmony with Julian's quiet guidance. The audience, who had been watching in stunned silence, began to applaud softly. It wasn't the raucous cheering that Julian had expected. It was something deeper, something more genuine. The crowd understood. They understood that what they were witnessing wasn't a performance. It was a story of trust, of healing, and of redemption. And as Julian wheeled Thunder around the arena, his heart swelling with emotion, he realized that this was what mattered. This wasn't about winning a ribbon or a trophy. It wasn't about proving anything to the doubters or the critics. It was about showing the world what was possible when two broken souls found each other and learned to trust again. The performance ended, and the crowd stood. The applause was thunderous, but Julian barely noticed it. He wasn't focused on the cheers or the admiration. He was focused on Thunder, who stood proudly at his side, his head held high. The announcer, his voice filled with awe, spoke again. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we've just witnessed is nothing short of extraordinary. Julian Price, the young man in the wheelchair, has not only shown us the power of trust, he's shown us the strength of the human spirit." Julian's heart swelled with pride, but it wasn't because of the applause. It was because, for the first time in 2 years, he felt truly alive. He had done something that had once seemed impossible, something that no one, not even he, had thought was possible. And as he looked down at Thunder, the horse who had walked beside him every step of the way, Julian knew that their journey was far from over. This was only the beginning. Julian sat quietly in the back of the van, his hands folded in his lap as they drove away from the state equestrian championships. The roar of the crowd still echoed in his mind, but it felt distant now, like a fading memory. He had expected the applause, expected the accolades, but none of that was what lingered with him, what stayed with him, what filled him with a quiet, lasting pride, was the moment Thunder had walked with him, side by side, without hesitation. The competition had been just the beginning. Julian hadn't expected the doors it would open, or the ripple effect that would spread far beyond the arena. That night, when he had stepped off the stage, something inside him had shifted. The connection with Thunder wasn't just about riding or performing. It was about something far deeper, the power of vulnerability, the healing power of trust. And that message had resonated with so many. The video of their performance went viral. Clips of the two of them. Julian in his wheelchair, Thunder walking calmly by his side, circulated across social media like wildfire. Headlines blared, "The boy in a wheelchair who tamed a wild stallion," and "Trust overcomes everything, the unlikely bond of Julian and Thunder." The images were everywhere, on news websites, shared on Facebook, Instagram, even Twitter. People couldn't get enough. But it wasn't just the viral moments that caught attention. It was what happened next that was the real story. A week after the competition, Julian and Thunder were invited to an event by a nonprofit organization that worked with children with disabilities. The organization had been following their story from the beginning. And they saw the impact Julian's bond with Thunder could have. They wanted to feature them as ambassadors for equine therapy, a therapy that had already been proven to be transformative for children with physical and emotional challenges. Julian had never considered becoming an ambassador. In fact, he hadn't even thought about what kind of impact his story might have on others. But the invitation felt different. It felt like a calling, and it felt like something he couldn't ignore. When they arrived at the Equine Therapy Center, the atmosphere was unlike anything Julian had ever experienced. The horses were calm, their coats shining in the afternoon sun. The children, most of them nonverbal or with severe physical disabilities, were already in the center, their eyes lighting up as they saw the horses. Julian and Thunder walked into the barn, and the children's faces lit up as they saw the boy in the wheelchair, the one they had heard about on the news. One of the children, a young girl named Sophie, was brought forward. She was nonverbal, and her parents had explained that she had severe autism, making it difficult for her to communicate with others. But as soon as Sophie saw Thunder, her face broke into a wide smile. She reached out her arms, and the caretakers gently guided her towards the stallion. Julian wheeled himself closer, his heart racing in his chest. He had no idea what to expect, but he knew that this moment, this quiet meeting, could change everything. Sophie, her eyes wide with wonder, slowly reached out to touch Thunder's neck. The horse stood still, his large head lowered to meet her. Sophie giggled, the sound sweet and pure as she stroked the horse's mane. Julian watched, his chest tight with emotion. He had never seen anything so beautiful. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be part of something bigger than himself. This wasn't about him. It was about giving these children a chance to experience what he had with Thunder. A quiet, unspoken bond that could heal wounds, both physical and emotional. As the day continued, Julian and Thunder worked with more children. Each interaction was different, but the results were always the same. The children who had been withdrawn, non-responsive, or anxious began to open up. Some smiled, some giggled, and a few even spoke their first words. Thunder was a gentle giant, his calm presence soothing and reassuring. He responded to each child with the same quiet patience he had shown Julian, and for every child he interacted with, the bond grew stronger. It wasn't just Thunder's presence that made a difference. It was Julian's, too. His calm, steady demeanor, the trust he had in the horse, and the way he spoke softly to each child as they worked together had a profound impact. His story was no longer just about overcoming his own struggles. It was about using his journey to help others find their own strength. One particular moment stood out to Julian. It was toward the end of the day, and a young boy named Eli, who had been particularly quiet, was brought over. Eli had been paralyzed from the waist down in a car accident and had spent most of his life in a wheelchair, much like Julian. His parents explained that Eli had never really formed a bond with animals. They were just too unpredictable for him. But when Eli saw Thunder, something in him changed. He reached out, his small hand brushing against the horse's mane, and for the first time that day, he smiled. It wasn't a big smile, but it was a smile nonetheless. And it was enough. Julian watched from his wheelchair as Eli slowly guided Thunder around the pen. Thunder followed Eli's direction with ease, his steps steady and slow, mirroring the boy's gentle commands. Julian could see the connection between them, the same quiet understanding that he had with Thunder. It was as though the horse knew, without being told, that Eli needed something from him, something that could heal the brokenness in both of them. Later, as the day wound down and the children began to leave, the director of the therapy center approached Julian. She was a woman in her mid-40s with kind eyes and a warm smile. "I just want to say thank you," she said softly. "What you and Thunder have done here today is nothing short of a miracle. I've never seen the kids respond like this. You've given them something they didn't even know they needed." Julian nodded, his heart full. "I didn't do anything," he said quietly. "It's Thunder. He's the one who's been teaching me." The woman smiled, her eyes glistening. "You've taught them too, in your own way, by sharing your story, by showing them that anything is possible. That's the greatest gift you could give." As Julian wheeled himself toward the van, Thunder walking steadily by his side, he couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. What had started as a personal journey, a way to heal himself, had now become something so much bigger. His bond with Thunder had rippled outward, touching lives in ways he had never imagined. The video, the applause, the attention, they were all just part of the story. But the real story, the one that mattered, was the one that would continue unfolding with each child who touched Thunder's mane, with each person who heard their story and found the courage to trust again. And for Julian, that was the greatest victory of all. The sun was setting as Julian wheeled Thunder across the wide open field. The sky, painted with shades of orange and pink, stretched endlessly above them. There was no crowd, no cameras, no applause. Just the quiet hum of the evening breeze and the soft, rhythmic sound of Thunder's hooves against the earth. It had been a long journey for both of them. What had started as a simple connection between a boy in a wheelchair and a wild stallion had turned into something much greater, a story of trust, healing, and redemption that had touched thousands of lives. Julian had never expected it. In fact, he had never really thought that anyone would notice him or the horse he had once dreamed of riding. But the world had found them, and in return, they had shown the world that strength wasn't always about power or control. Sometimes the greatest strength came from the quietest places. But today, for the first time in a long time, it was just Julian and Thunder. No crowds, no expectations, just the two of them, sharing a moment of peace. Julian paused, his wheelchair slowly rolling to a stop in the middle of the field. He looked out across the horizon, the light of the setting sun casting a warm glow over everything. The world felt so still, so peaceful. For a moment, it felt as though time itself had slowed down. He could feel the presence of the horse beside him, his steady, calm energy, grounding Julian in the present. "You know," Julian said softly, his voice barely carrying in the wind, "I never imagined this. I never thought we'd get here." Thunder nickered gently, his head lowered to the ground as if he understood every word. Julian smiled, reaching down to gently stroke the horse's neck. The connection between them, the bond they had formed, was stronger than ever. It wasn't just about the trust they had built, it was about something deeper, something unspoken. It was about acceptance, healing, and the unyielding belief that even the wildest spirits could find peace, if only given the chance. Julian thought back to the days when he had first been brought to Silver Ridge, to the times when he had doubted himself and wondered if he would ever feel like he was whole again. He had been paralyzed, not just physically, but emotionally. The accident had taken so much from him, not just his ability to ride, but his sense of self, his confidence, his purpose. For months, he had retreated into himself, unsure of how to move forward, unsure if there was a way to heal from the wreckage of his life. But then, Thunder had come into his life. And somehow, through that wild, untamed horse, Julian had found his way back. Not just to himself, but to the world around him. He had learned that healing wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about having all the answers or doing things the right way. It was about showing up, about being vulnerable, about trusting, both in others and in yourself. As Julian sat quietly with Thunder, he thought about everything that had happened. The competitions, the media attention, the people who had been inspired by their bond. It had all been a whirlwind, a storm of emotions and experiences. But now, here in the stillness of the field, he realized that none of that was what had truly mattered. What mattered was the simple connection they had built, the quiet moments of trust and understanding that had formed between him and the horse. Maybe this was the point all along, Julian whispered, almost to himself. Maybe it wasn't about proving something to the world. Maybe it was about showing that even when we're broken, we can still rebuild. And sometimes we rebuild in a way we never expected. Thunder shifted beside him, his warm breath a steady reminder that he was still there. Julian ran his hand through the horse's mane, the simple gesture filling him with a sense of peace that he had long since forgotten. For so long, he had felt like a spectator in his own life, watching from the sidelines as the world moved on without him. But now, with Thunder at his side, he felt like he had a place in the world again, a purpose. Julian thought about the children they had worked with, the smiles on their faces as they had touched Thunder for the first time. The joy they had experienced when they realized that anything was possible, that even the most difficult challenges could be overcome with patience, trust, and a little help from those who cared. Their story had inspired so many, and in return, it had given Julian the strength to keep moving forward. But it wasn't just the children who had been touched by their journey. It was everyone. The people who had watched them, the people who had heard their story and found hope in it. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He and Thunder were no longer just a boy and a horse. They were a symbol, a living testament to the power of trust, healing, and resilience. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the field, Julian wheeled Thunder forward, the horse's hooves kicking up dust as they moved slowly across the open space. There was no rush. There was no destination. They were just two souls together in the quiet of the evening, moving forward, one step at a time. Julian looked ahead, a quiet smile spreading across his face. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't focused on what had been lost or on the obstacles that still lay ahead. He wasn't worried about what people thought of him or Thunder. He was just focused on the present, on the journey he had taken to get here, and on the journey that still awaited them. Together, they were unstoppable. And that was all that mattered. As they continued to move across the field, the final rays of the sun sank beneath the horizon, and the world around them grew still. In that moment, Julian realized that sometimes the greatest victories weren't the ones that made headlines. They were the quiet victories, the moments of connection, of trust, of finding peace in the most unexpected places. Julian and Thunder, side by side, were rewriting their own story, and that story, their story, would be their legacy.